Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 6 of the ATDev Podcast. I'm happy to be joined today by a longtime friend and colleague, Nathaniel Swenson. Thank you for being here, Nathaniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Owen.
Yeah, awesome. I know a lot about your background and career as we have known each other for probably over 10 years at this point, but could you give a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, I started out as a bike mechanic and I was really idealistic. Whatever kind of work I did, I wanted to try to save the world or make it a better place. And I went to architecture school. My degree is Bachelor of Science in Architecture. But all through college, I paid my way working as a bike mechanic. And one of the last things I learned in architecture school is that the construction industry is responsible for about 60% of the waste that humans create. And I learned that the way we're designing most buildings, they're basically disposable. And I decided that I wasn't really comfortable being part of that industry unless I could get a job at like a LEED certified architecture firm and specifically work on green building. My experience was that as a new graduate without any experience, those jobs weren't really available. So I kept working in the bike industry. And during college, I had minored in construction management and I got really interested in just the business side of things. So I
Yeah.
continued in the bike industry, but I shifted away from just turning wrenches to managing some small businesses in Seattle. I was the manager of a bike shop for about 4 years. And then I decided I wanted to start my own business. I felt an urge to do something more design related. And I started a design build company in 2008, right when the housing bubble was bursting, because I had
Yeah.
some friends who were underwater with their houses and they were just trying to at least break even when they sold them. So we looked at their houses and found some ways to do some remodeling that helped them get some of that value out of their house. And then I realized there was a real need for that. And I've always been drawn to work that helps people. So I did some remodeling from about 2008 to 2011. And I realized during that time that I am a really bad boss. I was working 80 hours a week and I was just getting burned out. So I got on Craigslist. And the reason we're sitting here and talking and that I'm in the assistive tech industry is I found a Craigslist ad for a job that was 3 blocks from my house. And the job was assembling and washing wheelchairs. So I got into the industry. I would call it at like the dishwasher level. And pretty quickly, I saw some ways that I could improve the business that I was working in. I started making custom solid seats for wheelchairs and started riding along with the owner of the business as he did the work of an ATP. And I was his technician and I was turning wrenches again, but I was repairing wheelchairs, and that work felt more impactful than working in the bike shop had. I was
Yeah.
starting to kind of caught the bug, the assistive tech bug.
Absolutely. And so what is an ATP?
ATP is an assistive technology professional. It's a license. You work a certain number of hours. I think it's 2,000 hours. And then you sit for a test. That's like the wheelchair bar exam. And once you're a licensed ATP, then you can recommend assistive tech like custom wheelchairs that is funded by Medicare. So you could be a wheelchair technician without a license, and you could recommend equipment for different types of funding. But to be able to go into any clinic and work with any type of funding, you need to be a licensed ATP in the US.
Yeah, fascinating. I, as a wheelchair user, have been working with ATPs my whole life and have a tremendous amount of respect for the knowledge and insight that they have and their ability to really promote independence and mobility. Without my power wheelchair, I wouldn't be here doing this podcast or running a company or any of the things I do. What does your training for an ATP look like? What types of things do you learn?
Yeah, my training, like, I rode along with my boss for quite a while. So I did my 2000 contact hours by learning how to do wheelchair fittings. So, in a way, an ATP is like a wheelchair tailor. You learn about the different conditions that people are living with and how those present and how you can best support people. And it starts with just taking measurements and then building a chair that is comfortable and supportive and protective of their skin. But the main thing is that it's like a base of operations. Like you mentioned, having assistive tech opens metaphorical doors in your life
And literal doors
and
too.
literal doors. Yeah. And that's the job, is just making sure that you're listening to the end user and that their needs are driving the process. And it's really cool because we walk into a room in a clinic and you meet someone who uses assistive tech, and you meet their occupational or physical therapist, or sometimes we even worked with a speech language pathologist, and you just start to understand the picture of what it is they're living with and what they want to do. And then you start to build bridges between disabilities and possibilities using the tech.
I love that. Yeah. And how did your work as an ATP transition to what you're doing now with robotic arms?
One of my favorite parts about being an ATP was you need a certain number of continuing education credits to maintain your license. I think it's 25 hours a year, and you go to these hotels and sit in conference rooms and you learn about the new advancements in assistive technology, but you also learn about the profession and kind of the craft of designing seating systems. And I would frequently take many more hours of CEUs than were required. And I was just like a sponge. I wanted to learn as much as possible so that I could be as helpful as
Yeah.
possible. And I started to go to trade shows. I was really lucky. I worked for a small business and they didn't have a huge budget, but they sent me to trade shows and trainings in other cities. And the place where I met Jayco, where I first encountered Kinova's products, was the International Seating Symposium in Vancouver, in British Columbia. I think this was 2016, maybe 2015. And I ran into Ron Borgschulte, who owns the U.S. distributor for Kinova's products, Partners in Medicine. I was just walking down a row, and this robot swung out right in front of my face. And then I started talking to Ron about it, and I was just fascinated. And I could immediately see the potential benefits. We have all these great mobility products that move you from point A to point B. And then once you get in the room, if you have limited use of your arms and hands, there aren't as many things that you can do there. So I was really intrigued by this robot that could empower people to reach out and change the world. And after talking with Ron for a while, he offered me a job as a product specialist for his team. And that job was flying all over the country and just introducing people to Jayco. So I would go into a clinic with the robot, I'd put it on their chair, and then we would just immediately start doing things. And you would see people doing things for the first time. It's like when you and I met. I put Jayco on your
Yeah.
chair,
That's how we
and
met.
you have this new power, right? It's like you've gained a superpower, and the sky's the limit.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who don't know, the JCO is a 6th degree of freedom robotic arm that primarily mounts to power wheelchairs and enables people with disabilities to, like Nathaniel was talking about. And it's really opened up a world of possibilities for myself and for others.
Yeah. And the biggest barrier to getting assistive tech is funding. One of my passions when I was providing wheelchairs and later when I provided Jayco was learning the magic words that need to be shared with funding sources to convince them that this assistive tech is medically necessary.
Right.
And I was always interested in pushing the barriers of what could be funded. When I provided wheelchairs, it was really difficult to get a flotation cushion like a Roho covered by insurance.
Yeah.
And I learned that by educating Washington State Medicaid about the costs and the impact on someone's life of getting a pressure injury, they learned that, gosh, this is going to cost $20,000 to treat a stage 3 pressure injury. So you get their attention for what I think of as the wrong reason. You give them a financial motive,
Mhm.
but you also explain the human cost of that. It's extremely painful to have a pressure injury, and it's preventable. So rather than paying $20,000 and allowing that suffering to occur, we explain to them that you can just buy a $600 cushion and prevent all of that. So there's a cost incentive that you explain to the funding source, but then there's the human benefit, and that's what's much more interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's why, for me at least, a big reason why we started ATDev is to be able to build technologies that allow people to age in place with dignity. I think there's a big Venn diagram between the aging and the disability community. I think something that I've always thought was funny is a lot of people are temporarily able-bodied, but
Yes.
eventually, on a long enough timeline, everyone acquires some form of disability, whether that's due to injury or old age. And so being able to, in our case at ATDev, to design and develop technology to enable people to be more comfortable and more healthy is it's very meaningful work.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're listening to this and you're in good health, enjoy that. It is a temporary condition, my fellow mortals.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I think it's a good reminder too of what's important in our life and our lives of our loved ones. Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about funding being one of the biggest issues. How do you, in your role at Kinova, you interact with a lot of international partners? How has that ch- changed your view of assistive technology and what can be possible?
Yeah. It expanded on something that I think I already knew, which is where you're born and the circumstances that you're born into determine how much of the world is accessible to you. And that could be for financial reasons. But when it comes to health and assistive technology, Belgium's an interesting example. If you're born in, I believe it's the western part of Belgium, there's a more progressive healthcare system in that part of the country. And you're going to be able to get a really nice wheelchair covered by insurance and maybe a robotic arm. But if you're on the other side of the country, it's much more difficult to access funding. And that's just a microcosm of what goes on in the world. The US, I would say, for advanced assistive technology like a robotic arm or a wheelchair with all the actuators and standing features, the US is it's decent. We know that there are just horrendous problems with our health insurance situation in the US. I think there's over
Yeah,
260 different health insurance providers in the US. So part of the
yeah,
complexity is just figuring out which type of coverage you have and what is accessible. But in countries like Germany and the Netherlands that have more progressive health insurance plans, it's really not a matter of how much does the tech cost. It's a matter of proving that there is a need for it and then demonstrating that the technology exists and it's meeting that need, and then the funding is made available. So I think that there are models to follow, and what we see is that these products amortize themselves. Yes, there's a big sticker price on something like a robotic arm, but I'll just give you an example of a friend of mine who lived in Arizona. She had chronic kidney stones. She was dehydrated. She had a caregiver, but even if you have a caregiver, you have to constantly ask for every sip of water to be delivered to you. So we did a test and we put Jaco on her chair, and she was able to hydrate at will. And she loved that. She just constantly sipped water. And her chronic kidney stone issue that had put her in the hospital at least once a year resolved. So her insurance company saw that these $60,000 to $75,000 hospital visits went away, and they realized that the investment in the robotic arm was worth it. And I think that's true
yeah,
of any assistive tech. Like we could look at someone who has a high level of need. You could completely kit out their home, their wheelchair. Say you spend $1 million on them. Those health insurance providers are going to save money no matter what the cost is of
yeah,
the tech. If you just set someone up, you're going to save money. So that's, again, I think of that as an example of doing the right thing for the wrong reason, but that's what it takes to work in our current funding environment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very insightful, and it definitely resonates with something I think a lot about. What is the future of assistive technology for someone like myself a lot of times who is, basically completely paralyzed from the neck down, and I am excited and optimistic about the future in a lot of ways because of the technology that has enabled me to have meaningful work and have meaningful relationships and be able to contribute to my community, and my life is really good. And a big part of that is in thanks to technology. So I think it's really important for ATPs and people that are in the assistive technology ecosystem to keep pushing forward and developing new solutions, both product wise, but also funding wise and community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for anyone listening who is aware of assistive tech that might be helpful for them and thinking it's too expensive or I don't know how I'm going to pay for it, what I've learned is you have to ask. But it felt absurd the first time I asked an insurance company to pay for a power seat elevator when I asked Medicaid in Washington to pay for that because they don't cover it. It's not a huge expense, but it's hard to ask an insurance company for something they're not familiar with. But then when you explain that this can match the transfer surface when you're transferring from the chair to a bed or the chair to a toilet, so it makes the transfer safer. You can elevate yourself when you're crossing streets, so it makes you more visible to traffic and less likely to get hit. It improves the social experience. You can meet people at eye level. So you just have to learn how to explain it to people. And they might say no. And then you appeal and you appeal and you take them to court. And
Yeah,
eventually you can educate these entities. It's easy to think of them as a foe, as someone who's just denying things that you need. And they do that, and it's tragic. But these entities are staffed by people who have beating hearts. And I do believe that they can be reached and that the individuals in these companies are capable of empathy and that the company's policies can change over time. But you have to ask for it and you have to fight for it. And part of the way we do that with Kinova products in the US is there's a full time family advocate. There's just an absolute hero named Lauren Bakken. And the idea of her family advocate came from an end user who was trying to get coverage for Spinraza. When you're familiar with this fight, it's a very
I
expensive
am.
treatment, and Spinraza, they have a family advocate. It's a role within the company where they just fight for coverage on behalf of the end user and their family. And I realized that was something that we needed. So we have a full time family advocate in the US, and she helps each user jump through all of those funding hoops and provide any information they need for their appeal.
Yeah, I have worked with family advocates, and I agree they're absolute heroes, as you said. So for those of people who are interested in learning more about assistive technology or maybe want to look at it as a career, what where can they start?
Hmm, that's a good question. You might have to fix this in post while I think about it for a minute. Let's see. I think reaching out to your local assistive tech providers. So there are wheelchair vendors. Like every business, there are the big whales in the business, and then there are the independent, the kind of mom and pop shops. I would encourage people to reach out to a mom and pop shop. They tend to be a little bit more flexible and maybe a little bit more approachable. But just try and find an ATP in your area or find an occupational or physical therapist who works with assistive tech and ask if you can schedule an informational interview and just learn more about the work that they do.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you. Um, Thank you so much for being here, Nathaniel. It's really a pleasure to see you as always, and thank you again for all the work that you've done and helping me get my robotic arm and the countless other things that you have helped with over the years and what you continue to do for our community and our future as assistive technology users and developers.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm always happy to work with you, my friend.
All right, take care and stay tuned for the next episode.
Will do.